to Off the Shelf. I'm your host, Yvonne Wolf. Today, our special guest is a returning guest. Glenbrook South English teacher John Cowlin wrote Monster City. His second book is Baby Moses, published by Amica Press. Let's welcome John back.
Hey, how's it going?
Nice to see you again, John. So
Yeah, it's been a while.
John, your first book has an oddly humorous section on the Appalachian Americans. Is this another interest you have to let your readers understand other Americans that don't show up on YouTube's and Netflix?
No, the first book was more of a callback to a bunch of, it was a horror story or horror mystery story. And so I had a callback to a bunch of different kind of horror movie tropes. So, it had like this hillbilly cannibal mutant type of thing going on in it. And that was kind of a callback to something like Texas Chainsaw Massacre or The Hills Have Eyes. But this book, Baby Moses, is more of a historical fiction, and it takes place, I'd say more, it takes place in the 1950s, but it takes place more in the real world where, this didn't happen, but I think it could have happened. It started with a scene in my head where I imagined this two Klansmen tied to chairs in a cellar, and sitting across from him is this huge black guy with a Klan hood on his head and a pipe wrench on his lap. And so that was the first image I had of the book. So then my question was, okay, how do we get here? And then, what happens next?
Very dramatic opening. Or is the book doesn't open there? It's just the scene.
No, that was the middle.
That's the middle. Okay, so
yeah,
maybe a little bit make me think of the basement scene in the Pulp Fiction.
Right. Yeah.
So do you see values of urban Americans vastly different from less metropolitan or regular Americans?
I guess what I think is I think that their values are shaped by their landscape. I think that we spend our day looking around and seeing things and listening to things, and then we take in all this input, and then we start to make decisions about it. And I guess one of the things I was trying to get to in this book is that the more I wrote it, the more I thought that how much the slavery in America is part of our landscape, and we don't quite appreciate how much the landscape it is shaping our values. There's a scene in every King Kong movie where, our protagonists are walking through the jungle and someone stumbles into a hole and they're scrambling to get out.
Yes.
And the camera pans back and you see that it's not a hole, it's a giant footprint, but the person in the hole can't see the footprint from where they are. They don't have the perspective for it.
No.
And to me, that's where we all are. The footprint of slavery is so huge that we don't even know we're in it. We can't see the shape. We can't see the outline. And it's here every day, everywhere, and we cannot really know it, but it's shaping our values to this day, I think.
It's very interesting. Very interesting. So what you're talking about is the geography and the topography of what we grow up with, right? The different part of America, different regions of America.
I think so, yeah.
Yes, and I think that backdrop when you mentioned this slavery, it's also just this Civil War, the Antivalentine, that the effect of that on Americans now, even though we feel like, oh, that's 150 years ago.
When I was writing this, my dad's 83, and he still has the same job he's always had. He still works 50 hours a week. He hasn't slowed down at all. So he's totally, a functional adult, whatever you want to call it. And one day as I was writing this, he came over, and so my daughter was in the room, and she's a little kid, and she's looking at him, and she's old enough that when she's a grown woman, my dad's dead, she'll still remember who he was. She's old enough to remember it. Well, I got to thinking that if you go back to when my dad was her age, right? Mm-hmm. So 1945.
Yes.
And if he would, or 44 or whatever, And if he was to meet someone
Mhm.
as old as then as he is now, well, everyone he meets over that age would have been alive before the Civil War.
Wow.
So that goes for every living American right now over the age of like 83, 84.
Mhm.
Um, they've all met people who were, there's people alive today who met former slaves.
Yes.
So
Yes.
this notion that this American Civil War happened eons ago, back in the Stonehenge days,
Mhm.
I, I know it happened, 150 years ago, and I know that it happened generations ago. But another way to consider it is, it happened 2 people ago.
Mhm. Mhm.
It happened
Yes.
to my dad, and then someone my dad met. It happened
Yes.
2 people ago. It's not a
Yes.
trillion years ago.
Right. It's very interesting you mentioned that because I have often felt that way. That what's 100 years? It's only two generations. It's only one grandfather away in that way. If I want my children to meet World War II veterans, I think this is a right. This is a time to do it because when they become grandfathers, that would be a something to recall. Something that I met a World War II veteran.
But we're almost to the point where us to the World War II is World War II to the Civil War.
Yes.
Where World War II is like a halfway point. But
Hmm.
the World War II to me is, we're still making movies about it. We still talk about it. It's still part of the, you know,
Family history. Yeah,
yeah,
family.
it's part of the family history. Yeah.
Yeah,
But it
family
seems like the
experience.
Civil War, we try to put it in a different context, like it was, Stonehenge ago, or it
Yes,
was
yes.
Easter Island ago. It was prehistoric or something
Mm.
like that. And it just wasn't prehistoric.
No, no. If you read Faulkner, it's very much they live with
Yeah, right.
the immediate family. Then who was the inspiration for this book, Baby Moses? You have two protagonists.
Um, so you mentioned Faulkner a moment ago, and what I really wanted to do was write a Southern noir type thriller. That's really what I wanted to do. It wasn't so much what the book was about; it was more like how it sounded.
Hmm.
And every idea I came up with was just terrible. It was always like a bank robbery gone wrong, or it was, a drug deal gone wrong. It's just cliche, just hack trash. And then I was reading something in the news, or watching something on YouTube or whatever, and it's on the news, and I forget exactly what it was. But then it occurred to me the question: well, what if the protagonist was black instead of white?
Hmm.
And that that changed everything. And like I said, that scene in the cellar with a black man in a Klan hood facing down two Klansmen tied up to chairs,
Hmm.
um, it popped in my head, and I had no idea why they were there. Uh, so my first question is, well, how did we get there? And then once I was writing it for a while, I got to that point, and then my question was, well, what happens next? So that was really it happens more in the center of the book, but
Hmm.
really that image was really what started the whole thing.
I remember you in our first interview where you talked about how much you like the gumshoe detective, the 1950s look to that world.
Hmm.
So it's nice to hear you have that interest to recreate that story.
So I think one of the big differences is that first book was really kind of a throwback to that kind of, like you said, that gumshoe film noir, 1940s Sam Spade type of story. Um,
Johnny Dollar.
yeah.
Yeah.
As this one took off, though, I found that even though it's based on a crime, that's the motivating moment here, is the crime. It wasn't a crime story. It didn't turn into a detective story. It wasn't a crime story. It's the backdrop to um, a guy who tries to make good decisions.
Hmm.
And every step of the way, he makes the right decision. But because of who he is, the decision doesn't bear fruit. So even though he's doing exactly what the circumstances and the law and everything says, well, do this. He makes that decision. He goes down that path. It gets worse. He comes to another crossroads. Well, now make the right decision. He makes the right decision. He goes down that crossroads. It gets worse.
I see.
And so the question is, as that keeps happening, what does that do to a person, right? Like
You're-
what would the frustration and the sense of futility, what would that do to someone who's trying to accomplish a goal?
You mentioned the geography, how it affects our history and our relationship and our values. So, where are some places that you picked for this book? What places inspire you for this book?
Well, okay, so this is kind of a strange story. I wanted it just to be the South. I didn't want it to be a specific place. I don't know enough about it. If I put it in a specific location, I feel like it would be, not specific to that place because I wasn't knowledgeable enough. So I opened up maps and I opened up, websites, and I was looking for plants, and these trees are in Mississippi and this river name is over here. And I was just picking names of towns randomly out of different states. And this takes place in a county called Raymond. And so Raymond came from, I just randomly picked it from this map. Okay, so here's an interesting anecdote. In the book, Moses is coming down from Chicago to visit the woman who raised him. He was found in a basket by a creek. And
Yes.
that's why his name Moses. And he was
Yes.
raised by this woman, and she's name is Miss Cleo. And she's dying and she's sick. And so he comes down from Chicago to visit her in her last days. And as he comes down, what happens is there's two guys, Earl and Harv, or Enos and Harv, and they need $19 for a poker game, so they're going to go rob a black church on Sunday because they figure the law won't care if they steal 50 cents each from a bunch of black people in church. So when Moses comes down, that's happened, and his Miss Cleo was in one of those churches. So that's kind of what starts the story. But anyways, Moses comes down and she tells him that she's dying. Look, if you want to know who your mom's name is, you got to go to find this guy in the swamp. Go find Brujo in the swamp, and he'll tell you who your mother is. So I was writing this chapter. It's about halfway through the book, and Moses is in the swamp, and he's met Brujo, and it's a Wednesday morning when I'm writing this, and I'm writing this story, and I write it out, Hey,
Yes.
Brujo says, hey, here's your mom's name, and bad news, she died, and that's the story. So here's the weird part is I was adopted also as an infant, I wasn't found in a basket, but I was adopted.
No.
And my wife gave me for my birthday the year before a DNA test. So it was up on the DNA website, and the only hit was like some third cousin twice removed, like some kind of a connection that really didn't mean anything. But later that day, I got an email from that woman, and the email said, it's, from the information you've put on there, this is going to sound strange, but I'm really into genealogy, and I know who your mother was. So do you want to talk? And so that evening, I'm talking to her on the phone.
This is
and
the
she
same
says,
day?
Same day. It was that afternoon. She said,
Oh.
yeah, well, your mother's name was Peggy, and she gave me the whole story.
Okay.
And she says, I got bad news. She died 3 years ago. But I found out the name of my biological mother the afternoon that Moses did.
Wow.
And so I looked up Peggy's obituary,
Mhm.
and it turns out that I have two half-sisters.
Mhm.
So I looked to see where Peggy lived. She lived most of her life in Little Rock, Arkansas, which is about 20 miles away from Raymond, Arkansas, where I got the name of the town for the book for.
This is stranger than fiction.
Yeah, I mean that's the weirdest part is that it's not in the book, but that's the weirdest part. Yeah.
Yeah, that while you're writing about this character and you have somehow, in the email, I don't know, there's no plan on your part. And they
Yeah.
so you're connected now with half-sisters, two half-sisters?
Yeah. So
And you've met them? Have you visited and met?
Look, the book is about Moses. It starts with Moses on a bus.
Yes.
And he's going from Chicago down to Raymond, wherever that is, to see his, like I said, to see the woman who raised him.
Yes.
Fast forward a month, and I'm on a train heading down to Arkansas to meet my sisters for the first time.
Wow.
Yeah.
So some of that writing must come easier for you now, because
Yeah, I don't know. It was definitely a strange, unbelievable coincidence. And when I tell people, it's hard to, I don't know.
nope. Yeah.
It's hard for me to believe it's a true story.
Yes. What a good story though. And
Yeah.
now, so going south, do you feel that helped you with the topography and describing the what it looks like?
I don't know if it did. Uh, not only is this about the South, it's also about the 1950s,
Yes.
right? And it's also about a man who's black. So those are obviously three things that I've not experienced. I haven't lived in the South. I didn't live in the 1950s. I'm a white guy.
Right.
So my approach to it was not so much, my approach to it was, who is this person on an individual, as an individual character, who is this person? And as I was writing him, I tried to get him to know him as well as I could. I know it sounds kind of like a corny author thing to do, but I tried to, get to know this guy as a person. And I didn't really approach it as a treatise on what it's like to be black in the South in 1950s. I approached it more like, here's a thing happening to this guy. He pulls into town. There's armed gunmen robbing churches on the weekends, and the police don't want to do anything. They refuse to do anything about it. What would he do? And what would the obstacles be that are up against him? And then the story just kind of came from that.
Mm-hmm. So let me show the cover of your book.
Oh yeah, thank you.
Yes. In this book, did you have any trouble naming your characters, Enos and Harv?
Well, names for me are part. I don't know about other writers, but that's almost how I create the characters. I just make a huge list of names, and then I start picking names, and the characters kind of come from the names. I think I named him Moses before I figured anything else out about him. And once I named him Moses, and it was like, oh, and he'll be found in a basket, and oh, he'll, that let my people go, refrain from the song. Like, okay, well that's a motif in this, right? And he's gonna be kind of literary. He's gonna read a lot of books.
Mm-hmm.
It just kind of comes from that name.
Yes.
Enos and Harv, my problem, and they're the two, gunmen, the two racist Klansmen who are kind of the antagonists of the story. My problem with that is Enos was a character on this old show called The Dukes of Hazzard. He was one of the deputies.
I remember that. I remember that.
But the problem is that Enos was like the nice one. There was a couple of these deputies, and he was the nice one. But in the book, Enos is the leader. But in the show, Enos was always the follower. And so in my head, I totally should have reversed it, because in my head, I have the hardest time remembering the difference between Enos and Harv because of the connotation I have with the name Enos. In the show, he was more like a Gomer Pyle type of
Didn't he have a stutter? Or
I think that was Roscoe. I think Roscoe had the stutter, and Enos was kind of like the sweet
sidekick. And
my names were reversed in the book, because I kept thinking that Enos would be the sidekick, and he's not. He's the leader of the two.
So did you finish the book before the pandemic hit, or?
Yeah, I finished it. I finished it last spring before the pandemic, and so I spent a couple of months revising and getting it ready to publish. Really, the pandemic didn't, aside from the fact that I can't really go out and try to talk to people about it, it has to be all over the computer instead of in person. It really didn't change anything about the writing of the book. I found that personally, for me, the pandemic is, when it comes to creative output, it's a nightmare. Like, I can't, like, the last thing I want to do is be creative. I just want to crawl up in a ball and watch TV. I don't want to.
Yes, the motivation part, huh? How do you deal with it? I mean, but it's good. So I guess it's a good thing. You're lucky that you finish the book before
Yeah,
the lull comes in. And
yeah.
so was it already at the publishers by the time March came
Um,
around?
it came out like a month or so ago. You know, I talked to Amica Press about it. I forget the exact timeline, but we had talked about it, and then um, they had some questions about it, and then we talked about it, and they seemed like they were gung ho on it. So um, it got some reviews. All the reviews are really positive. I'm really happy with the reviews.
Yes, I saw that. I
Yeah,
posted it on our Facebook page too,
yeah.
on your reviews. And so, so if you haven't been able to talk to people live about this book, have you been on some kind of Zoom interviews besides this one, or some other marketing? How does that change your marketing plan?
Yeah, it's really hard. I mean, we're still working on it. I mean, this is kind of early. I think that it's kind of we're thinking of two stages more or less, like a before and after. So so to speak, maybe something later in the spring, another push in the spring. So right now, maybe some radio, maybe some podcast stuff like that, and then in the spring, hopefully some in-person stuff if the world changes, which would be nice.
And are you going after this all by yourself, or do you have an agent who's helping you, or do you just go to Facebook and find a book club that you think and pitch
Yeah,
your book to? Or
I mean, Compress helps out a lot. I mean, we're just kind of doing it together, I think.
oh, so they do help you, the
Hmm.
Amica Press. Yes, I well, that's how that's how nice it was to get to hear about
Hmm.
your book, and got your book through J Amber with Amica Press. So it's very nice to hear you're so productive. Now, do you have a third book coming along?
No, not right now. I had a couple ideas for it, like one of my ideas was like what would happen in this town 20 years later or
Mm,
25 years later, like in the mid
hmm
70s. Um, I'm still playing with it, so there's nothing really there yet.
And John, so you had no idea this 2020 would play out this way, where the social justice becomes such a um, on the top of everyone's mind. So, what do you plan for your readers with this book? Did you have some kind of message before this, or
Well, uh, you're right. Um, Back in, I think it was May, uh, when some of the protests started happening, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar had in the LA Times an op-ed piece, and he put in one sentence what it took me an entire book to try and say, but he was able to
mm,
say it in a sentence. He said, the Black community is used to the institutional racism inherent in education, the justice system, and jobs. And even though we do all the conventional things to raise public and political awareness, the needle hardly budges. And that phrase, the needle hardly budges, like that's at the heart of the story. And that was there when I started writing it. Like I said before, what if this guy keeps making all the right decisions? So many times, uh,
mhm,
in order for a crime type story or a thriller type story to happen, someone has to make a mistake. Because if you do the right thing all the time, you're not going to get caught. Or if you do the right thing all the time, you'll catch the guy, whatever it is.
you're
So,
being positively rewarded? You mean?
right. If
Yes.
you're a good person and you do everything right, you
hmm
do it the way you're quote unquote supposed to.
hmm
But in this circumstance, trying to find justice for a crime that people aren't interested in finding justice for, and he makes there's a point in the middle in the cellar where he makes the wrong decision. But up until then, he makes every decision correct, and it ends in that cellar, right? With those two guys tied up. Um, so I'm trying to, the whole time I'm writing this, I'm trying to imagine the frustration, and that might not be the right word. Um, you know,
hmm
why don't you quit? If it's not going to do anything, if the needle will hardly budge,
hmm
why don't you quit? And why do you keep doing things the quote unquote right way? Why do you keep doing things the conventional, the correct, so to speak, way? What would make you do that? So that was kind of like the North Star of the book, more or less, is this guy makes the correct decision, and the needle doesn't budge. The other North Star I had, the other rule I had for this was, so many times in movies especially, but movies and books alike, where there are Black protagonists, there's this trope of the white savior coming in, where a white character kind of comes in, kind of saves the day or makes things easier.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not to say that there aren't white people out there who help as much as they can, but it diminishes the efforts of the Black character when that happens.
Yes.
So my other rule was no white saviors.
Mm-hmm.
So there's not going to be no white character in this book is going to kind of like pop in and make things better. And that got really hard at times because I made a couple of characters that I really liked.
Mm-hmm.
I really liked a character named Emily, and she runs this diner. And I really liked this character, the deputy, Boone. And so there came moments in the book where, okay, this is the moment where this character is supposed to do A.
Mm-hmm.
And I really want the character to do A because that would make the character cool. That would make the character righteous. That would make the character a good person.
Yes.
The truth is, back in 1950, whatever, the character wouldn't choose A. The character would choose B.
You have to be realistic to the time period. Like they can't foresee the world as we see it now, right? I mean,
right.
Things have changed.
So both of those characters make the wrong decision. They both fail Moses at some point, and that was the hardest part to write.
Yes. So then, what is your message for our writers out there? Can you say that the second book is easier, or is it just as hard as the first book?
It seemed easier because it only took me 3 years instead of 10.
Yes.
So that seemed easier.
Maybe organization or
the best piece of I'll tell you a piece of advice that I heard, and I'll tell you the piece of advice that I have. My piece of advice that I heard was set for yourself a page minimum when you're writing.
Yes.
That is doable.
Very good.
Not time. Not time. You're not going to say, I'm going to write for an hour. You're going to say, I'm going to write 3 pages, or I'm going to write 5 pages.
Yes.
And if it's a day, then do it a day. If it's a week, then do it a week. If it's 10 pages a week on Sundays, then just write on Sunday for 10 pages. But you have to hit your page minimum. You can't have excuses about it. If it takes you 5 minutes, great. If it takes you 5 hours, that's what you got to do. So that's the best piece of advice I ever heard. The piece of advice I have is, and this goes for both the books I've written, is come up with that keystone scene. Come up with that moment in the book that you're looking forward to. You don't have to write it first, but you have to write to it. And you want to get to this moment. This is the moment you're working towards. And then after that, you kind of ask yourself, honestly, what would be the natural outcome once we got here? And that I think that moment could be towards the beginning. That moment can be towards the end.
Those are good advice because you're giving us something concrete, some quantitative goal that you have to get to a certain page and then get to a certain scene. And from that scene, where does the story go? It's very nice to see you again, John. And thank you for coming on our program.
Oh, it's great to see you too. Yeah. Oh, thanks a billion. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Yes. And thank you for watching Off the Shelf. See you next time.